Hello everyone and welcome to the most average chapter of One Piece that we've gotten in 2020. I think that's fair to say, right? If you disagree with that, that's fine. Just let me know what other chapter that we've gotten during the year has been either just as average as this one or even less average than this one. Maybe 971 gives this one a run for its money, but let me know. However, just because the chapter was average doesn't mean that my review should be. So I'm gonna give you something juicy, or at least try and give you some quality here, because the truth of the matter is that if I can't sit through my own stuff, if what I'm saying or what I'm talking about is boring me to death, then I don't upload it. I just don't think it's fair and respectful to say, oh, here, watch this, even though I can't sit through it. So let's get started and let's try and give you some quality.
We finally get the ending to Capone's cover story, which is awesome. I'm glad it's ending. I think he probably could have ended this last week with the picture of all the family together, but I guess Oda wanted to show that Capone was still being pursued by the Marines. And I guess the big question here is, like, where do you think they're headed? Where is Capone going after this? I think it's important to remember that this whole cover story started with Chiffon's desire to want to be reunited with her sister Lola. And so initially Capone was making plans to go to Thriller Bark, but once they got to the Red Line, they had to turn back because the reverie was still going on and a bunch of Marine ships attacked them. So I don't know if they're going to run into Moria because they were aiming for Thriller Bark initially, but I do think that ultimately these characters have to end up in the same place as Big Mom because of the narrative threads, the unresolved sort of plot lines and lack of closure that there's been between these characters and Big Mom. Now, whether that happens in Wano or in Elbaf, I'm not sure, but it is pretty much a guarantee that these characters, that Capone's family, will be running into Big Mom at some point in the future. We start at the top of Onigashima and we get a sense of scale for how large the skull actually is, because you get to see the horns of the skull in comparison to Dragonform Kaido. So if you look at Dragonform Kaido in that first panel, look at how small he looks. I mean, Kaido is huge, right? But look at how small he looks in comparison to the skull horns. I mean, this continent Puller Oni was huge, right? And then if you actually zoom in a little bit more, you'll see that some of the cliffs are sliced up from last week because of Kaido's attack. Kiku falls to the floor, her helmet is off, and then Izo tries to stop the bleeding by creating a tourniquet. And then it's Firefox to the rescue because Kinemon uses his sword to cauterize the wound, which I really appreciate because I thought this was a very creative choice. I don't think anybody predicted that this is how Kiku's wound would be healed. Now, surprisingly, by the end of this scene, Kiku actually gets a new sword. If you compare the hilt and the guard of the sword that she's holding by the end of this scene to the previous sword that broke in the previous chapter, you'll find that those are two completely different swords. The hilt is completely different, the guard is different, so they probably had a replacement to give her just in case. If you can identify its previous owner, please let me know in the comment section below. I think it looks a lot like the sword that Denjiro had as a kid. You can also see that the minks, Nekomamushi and Inuarashi, are huffing and puffing, trying to catch their breath. And to me that implies, unfortunately, that their Sulong form is about to run out.
There's a scene where Inuarashi tells his subordinates to get out of the roof, which I think that's kind of foreshadowing how bad things are going to get. And I also think that that's going to be used later on for the minks to say, oh, we survived because Inuarashi told us to leave just in time. Then Kaido starts talking about death, and I'm actually going to use his words to make a point by the end of this review, so hang tight, okay? But for now, I think it's interesting that he mentions Roger and Whitebeard, the way they died. But what really stands out to me is who he doesn't mention. He doesn't mention Rocks. He doesn't mention Sebek. So it's kind of like, why wouldn't he? If Sebek actually died, right, according to what we know, why didn't he mention Sebek? I've always said, or I've maintained, that I think that Sebek is either coming back or that he's still alive somewhere, some way. Unless Sebek had a very dishonorable death, and then maybe Kaido didn't see it fit to mention his previous captain, but it's kind of strange if you think about it. Kaido turns into his human form. I'm not really sure where he was able to get the club from, but yeah, it just seems like it seems like a parent who's about to discipline their child grabbing a belt. We got the Thunder Baguas buffet getting ready to open here. You can smell the fresh bread coming out of the oven for this buffet.
So, third time's the charm, folks. This pretty much confirms Kaido's fighting style. I said this before, but if you were to rank his forms, I think it's obvious now that he first starts off with dragon form, just goofing around and stuff. Then he goes into human form. It's the same pattern he used with Luffy and with Odin. And then if you can push him hard enough, you should get his hybrid form. We get that map again of the floor levels, and we find that Luffy has advanced one floor. So last week he was in B1, now he's in the actual first floor. Now if you want to plug in some kindergarten math here, if Luffy goes up one floor per chapter, and he's currently in the first floor, and this is chapter 994, that means that Luffy will reach the top of Onigashima by chapter 999. Again, that's assuming that Luffy goes up one floor per chapter and that the roof of Onigashima doesn't just fall in on itself.
The fodder there recognize Luffy and Jinbei, but they don't recognize Sanji, and I thought that was interesting, mainly because I think maybe they probably know him as Soba Mask, right? But then one of the things that I've noticed about Sanji's character arc is that I think there has to be some closure, some resolution to the fact that Sanji doesn't accept the fact that he's Germa. Like every time a character calls Sanji Germa, he gets upset and he's like, don't call me that. I don't want to be associated with them. And then in this chapter, he's upset because he's not being recognized. So I think that Sanji's character arc, his true power will begin to shine once he accepts that he is in fact Germa, but that he doesn't have to follow in the ways of his family. We run into two gifters, Hamlet and Fortrix. Both names are obviously card game related. And Hamlet is a man whose body is stuck to a giraffe in the place of where the normal giraffe's head would be. And if you look at the giraffe's body, you see like squiggly lines all around it. So the giraffe is kind of like trembling, right? Like shivering and stuff. And so to me, that kind of signifies that the giraffe's body is trying really hard to keep its balance so that it doesn't fall down because it has a man stuck to its face. You can just imagine the editor going like, hey, Oda-sensei, nice work. I read your draft for chapter 994. I think it's good, but maybe it needs a little bit more, you know? Give the kids something else to talk about. Maybe you can reveal Sasaki's devil fruit power, or maybe you can reveal who Black Maria was singing about, or maybe you can give us an update about Ulti and Page 1 versus Usopp and Nami. And so Oda was like, oh no, that's way too rational. It makes too much sense. People will expect those kind of reveals in this chapter. You know what they'll never expect though? A chicken butt head man. You want to know another thing? Well, even if you don't, I'm going to tell you. So in the panel where Sanji is kicking Mr. Chicken Butt Head Face, you see the chicken flying away into the distance. But because the chicken's butt is the man's face, and because the man is spitting out blood because of Sanji's attack, it kind of looks like the chicken is pooping.
Now, according to the Library of O'Hara, Queen's ice bullets are a reference to a Japanese game of tag, where if you get tagged, you basically have to freeze in place. You can't move until somebody else who isn't frozen comes by and tags you again. Now, story-wise, I actually got a lot of Dressrosa vibes from this chapter, because not only do we now have a time limit, similar to what we had with the birdcage, but also Queen giving Apu the antidote really reminded me of how Doflamingo entrusted Diamante with the Mera Mera no Mi so that he would guard it so that nobody else would get it. It just becomes very obvious that the only reason for why Queen is volunteering this solution and giving it to Apu is because the story pretty much demands that the good guys come out on top and win. Which I get, you know, because this is the kind of story that this is. But at the same time, I would have made it more difficult for them instead of announcing it. I probably would have kept the antidote to myself, keep it a secret or something. But now Zoro's going to be chasing Apu for like an hour. Either that or he's going to get lost and end up at the top of the skull even before Luffy gets there. Also, because the ice bullets are affecting everybody, Queen is actually giving a lot of people a very legitimate reason to change sides and betray Kaido after this chapter. I mean, the Beast Pirates are getting frozen, the Oniwabanshu and the Mimawarigumi are surrounded. Apu now has a reason to change sides because of this. A part of me wants the antidote that Apu has to be fake, because if it is real, it just kind of makes Queen look like a moron.
That being said though, character-wise, this does make sense for Queen in a sense, because Queen is an entertainer. We saw how he behaved in Udon, right, where he was having like Luffy have like those matches like in this ring, right, with the collar. So yeah, he wants to make a game out of it, and he says it in this chapter, you know, you got to give these people a fighting chance, otherwise it's not entertaining. Kind of fits like the whole like all-star entertainment hierarchy thing that, you know, Oda introduced with Queen and Udon. Now, Chopper says that he's concerned over the effects that the bullets are having on the human body. And the moment he described the effects, I thought about, like I wonder what would happen if Brook were to be bitten or shot with one of those bullets.
Because, like, we already know that Brook can't die, technically, right? Because his body structure isn't human. So the 1 hour time limit wouldn't affect him. Secondly, Brook's soul energy is already very cold, and that's how he's able to use ice attacks, because he's channeling the cold air from the underworld. In fact, it's so cold that he was able to injure Prometheus with his ice. And then Brook also spent the time skip with the Long Arm tribe, and so that kind of gives him another connection with Apu, aside from them both being musicians.
So yeah, I kind of want Brook to play a role in intercepting Apu, but ultimately, I want Brook to get shot with one of those bullets. I want him to be able to use the ice to his advantage. Like, how cool would it be if he gets bitten and then turns into this giant soul ice demon for an hour and just starts wrecking stuff up? I think that'd be awesome for Brook, because the way the chapter leaves off, really, like, the main Straw Hats that don't really have, like, a whole lot to do right now are Brook, Chopper, and Robin. But, you know, Brook, I think, should fight Apu at some point. I think Chopper, like, this chapter and the Udon chapter with the plague kind of sets it up so that Chopper has to confront Queen at some point. I'm not saying it's going to be a full-on 1v1. I don't see how that would work, but I do think that Chopper has to confront Queen because he's been using science to hurt people. And so as a doctor, that's just really unethical. And then Robin, I don't know if Robin's going to fight Black Maria, because I don't even know if Black Maria is on Kaido's side anymore because of the song that she was singing. So maybe she's an ally. But, well, we do know one thing that Robin has to do, and that's find the road poneglyph. Actually, in the official translation, Chopper says that if they can just get their hands on the antibodies, Chopper can make a lot of medicine. So I'm pretty sure that that's going to be like what Chopper is going to be doing after they get the antibodies. So I think that's Chopper's role for the time being. But now let's get into the Yamato section of the chapter.
Okay, so I found it very interesting that this chapter 994 does almost the exact same thing that chapter 992 does, which is that the beginning and the ending of this chapter goes together. If you want to learn how Oda did it in 992, just go watch my review. I explain it there. And this chapter kind of does the same thing, where if you compare the beginning of this chapter with the ending of this chapter, you'll see that Kaido and Yamato are talking about the same thing, which is essentially that being willing to lay down your life for a cause that you believe in, that actually gets other people to respect you. That's what it means to be a samurai. That is the code of the samurai way of life. And we see the same thing in this chapter as well with Omasa, the Yakuza boss, who had been infected with the ice bullets, and how he was pretty much willing to commit seppuku before hurting any of his friends. So that's the theme of this chapter, 994. And as it just so happens, this chapter fits perfectly. It almost feels like it's the other half, the perfect complement to another chapter that came out not so long ago, and that was chapter 986. And the title of that chapter was My Name. So right from the title, you can tell there's a similarity between that chapter and this chapter. Now, in that chapter, Momonosuke is challenged by Kaido. Kaido essentially is about to execute Momonosuke, and he says, I don't really believe that you're Odin's son because you're very weak and you're a crybaby. So here's what we're gonna do. Just give me any other name. Say that you're anybody else aside from Kozuki Momonosuke, and I will let you live. And so he's giving Momo a way out, and Momo really thinks hard about what his answer is going to be until ultimately he says, no, you know what? My name is Kozuki Momonosuke, and I'm going to be the Shogun of Wano. And so that's the moment that not only made the editor cry, but it's also the moment where Momonosuke becomes a true samurai, because he's willing to put his life on the line to embrace that identity and that heritage. And as it turns out, that chapter is also the one where the Scabbards declare that they're starting the fight against Kaido.
And that's why I'm saying that those two chapters go together, because in chapter 986, Momonosuke embraces his name, and that marks the start of the Scabbards versus Kaido, whereas in this chapter, it's Yamato who accepts and embraces her name, and that marks the start of the Scabbards about to be defeated. Because Kaido tells the Scabbards in this chapter, alright guys, let's end this. And in 986, people started yelling, it's a raid, it's starting and stuff. Also, up until this chapter, Shinobu and Momonosuke were kind of wary of Yamato. They were weirded out by Yamato. It's like, who is this person, right? And so it is by accepting her name, like, my name is Yamato, that you see a change in Shinobu and Momonosuke's demeanor by the end of the chapter, where they're like, okay, like maybe we can trust this person. So it's kind of like the same dynamic that we see with Kaido, where Kaido was doubtful. He did not believe that Momonosuke was Oden's son until Momonosuke declared that he was in fact a Kozuki, right? Another connection between this chapter and 986 is that they both make reference to the same scene at the burning castle, where Kaido grabs Momonosuke and asks him, "Who are you?" right? If you remember, back in that scene when the castle was burning, Momonosuke did not answer the question. And then Yamato says in this chapter that she felt like she couldn't do anything either, because she wasn't strong enough. She was like, I was just looking up at you. I couldn't do anything. And so it's that sense of helplessness, that feeling of like not being able to do anything because you feel so inadequate, that gets resolved for both characters, for Momonosuke in 986 and for Yamato in this chapter, because she's actually protecting Momonosuke, which is something that she couldn't do back then. 986 is the chapter that gets Momonosuke one step closer to becoming the Shogun, and this chapter is the one that gets Yamato one step closer to becoming a Kozuki retainer. And so I definitely feel that by the end of the arc, Momonosuke will have gained a brand new retainer in Yamato. And in fact, I suspect that, you know, the ending of the arc will have Momonosuke order Yamato to go with Luffy, to go to Laugh Tale, so that she can finish the work that his father started. Maybe not as an official crew member, but as a representative of the Kozuki clan, just like Oden was with Roger. Another thing that this chapter does is that it confirms a Reddit theory, because Yamato talks about Oden's execution, and we get a flashback panel of Yamato during the execution. And so the Reddit theory said that if you go back to chapter 971 and look at, I think it's either page 4 or 5, but it's the scene where a guy falls into the oil and is burning on the floor. We get to see Yamato in chapter 971, but her face, her head is cut off in that panel. But if you compare what she's wearing, and if you compare the two guys beside her, they fit the panel that we see in this chapter perfectly. Because the guy on Yamato's right is grouchy, he has a frown, he's like, "Urgh." And then the guy on her left is wearing a circle pattern on his clothes. So it just fits perfectly. Even the place where she's standing fits the panel that we get in chapter 971. And so as Yamato is recalling all of this and talking to Shinobu about how she was also there to witness her speech, Yamato gets attacked by Sasaki's men. But it turns out she's fine.
And so unless it's somehow revealed later that Yamato has a double fruit power, I think the implication from this chapter is that Yamato can use Ryou. She uses it defensively to survive the explosion, and then she uses it offensively before the end of the chapter. If you remember, before Rayleigh shows Luffy Ryou, he tells Luffy that he should think about this application of armament haki as wearing an invisible armor. And so that's the power that Yamato uses here to protect herself from the explosion, and then later on Rayleigh also tells Luffy that if that invisible armor is strong enough, it can also be used offensively. And so if you notice, if you look at the blast in the panel where Yamato is hitting the porcupine and sending him flying, the way that Oda drew that blast in that panel is the exact same way that he drew the blast back in chapter 939 when Hyogoro used Ryou on the alpaca man. If you don't believe me, go back to that chapter and compare the two. It's literally the same blast. Also in chapter 984, we see that Luffy is fighting Yamato, and Luffy's about to throw a punch, and we see the invisible aura of Ryou forming around Luffy's fist. And then Yamato blocks the attack with a foot, and then the entire section blows up. So Yamato must have been using defensive Ryou in that moment, otherwise how would she be able to block the attack? Also, normal armament haki hardening and gear second wouldn't have caused that big of an explosion, so yeah, I'm pretty sure that Yamato is a confirmed Ryou user. Now, something very important here, something that's worth noting, is that even though I'm saying that Yamato can use Ryou, she cannot use the internal destruction Ryou that we've seen other characters use in the series. The internal destruction Ryou is something that's very rare, that not a whole lot of characters have been able to use, right? So Yamato thus far has not been shown to be able to use the internal destruction Ryou. The only 3 characters in the entire series that have been shown to use the internal destruction Ryou are Luffy, Rayleigh, and Sabo. If Yamato had been able to use the internal destruction Ryou, then she would have been able to remove her own exploding cuffs instead of having Luffy do it, right?
So just to give you a quick armament hockey recap, even though I made a video about this a long time ago and people had a problem with what I was saying, they really didn't agree with my interpretation, but that interpretation has withstood the test of time, and it works for me to understand what goes on with armament hockey. So what I said in that video essentially is that there's 3 levels of armament hockey, all right? 3. First one is the black hardening, right? The black coating armament hockey. That's the first level. One step beyond that is Ryou, which is the invisible armor that surrounds your body, like the aura that we've seen in the anime. And you can use that armor as either offensive or defensive power. You can use it to shoot it out, or you can use it to block and defend. And then the samurai use that as well on their swords to attack. And that was introduced all the way back in Alabasta when Zoro got a flashback to what his teacher was telling him. That's essentially Ryou, but Ryou for the samurai. And then the last level of armament hockey is the internal destruction, which again, that's the one that goes in you and just destroys you from the inside out. And we've only seen a couple of characters do that. So it goes black hardening, then Ryou, then internal destruction. And so with that in mind, and considering the fact that both Luffy and Zoro already know Ryou, Luffy knows the internal destruction Ryou, Zoro just knows Ryou, right? But because of what I was talking about last week in my review for chapter 993, I mentioned how Jinbei's Fishman Karate is also very similar to Ryou in its dynamics and its properties. I kind of want to think that maybe Jinbei is going to be able to use Ryou in this fight, in his upcoming fight, and maybe he's going to teach it to Sanji, or maybe Sanji's going to learn Ryou, and both Jinbei and Sanji will have Ryou by the end of this arc. I think it's just only natural, especially since Yamato has it, and if Yamato goes with them on the Sunny to Laugh Tale, I think it would make sense for both Jinbei and Sanji to have Ryou as well. Before I go, and because the theme of this chapter is about how the true measure of a samurai comes down to the ability of a samurai to lay down their life for a just worthy cause, I would be remiss if I did not mention one of the most famous Zoro quotes out there, which is a quote that he has back in the Baratie arc. And that's the one where Zoro says, "When I decided to follow my dream, I had already discarded my life." Last week we had Kaido saying, "Oh, there will never be a samurai as great as Odin ever again." And then in this chapter we kind of get a definition to what it actually means to be a samurai. And so that quote from Zoro just kind of makes it obvious that Zoro will play a role in proving Kaido wrong. I'm not saying that Zoro is going to be the one to kill Kaido in this arc, but if I wanted to come up with an emotional reason for it, I think there's enough theories suggesting that Shimotsuki Ushimaru was actually Zoro's father because they look so much alike. And we know that Shimotsuki Ushimaru died when he refused to join Orochi in a fight against Kaido. So if Kaido looks at Zoro, he could probably say something like,
"I remember your face. It looks very similar to that daimyo of Ringo, Shimotsuki Ushimaru. Nobody told you what happened to your father. I killed Mufasa."
So there you have it. Kaido killed Zoro's father. And I think it's interesting that Kaido hasn't actually run into Zoro, right? Like they haven't met face to face. Maybe that's why. Maybe that's why Oda was so careful about Zoro getting lost before Luffy got one-shotted by Kaido, so that Kaido wouldn't identify Zoro as a Shimotsuki. So that's it. That's going to do it for me. Like I said, the chapter was average. Hopefully you enjoyed this review, found it fruitful and juicy. Thanks a bunch for watching, guys. Subscribe if you haven't done so already. Like the video if you did. And I'll catch you guys later. Let me know what you thought about this chapter down below. Take care. Bye.